I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
This is a talk by William Cavanaugh, whose book is The Uses of Idolatry, and this is a talk on consumerism and idolatry that was first given for the Center for Catholic Social Thought at the Church of the Assumption in St. Paul, Minnesota, directed by Colin Miller. We hope you enjoy this. The Morin Academy has done a series on Dr. Cavanaugh's book, The Uses of Idolatry, and we highly recommend it. Thanks to the Church of the Assumption and the Center for Catholic Social Thought for allowing us to repost this great talk.
My honor to introduce Dr. Bill Cavanaugh, a good friend and colleague, or former colleague, and Bill is one of the leading Catholic intellectual voices in North America today. And his work on religious violence and his book, Torture and Eucharist, received national and international attention. And certainly his most recent book that Colin mentioned, The Uses of Idolatry, will certainly do the same, and that will be the topic for tonight. Dr. Cavanaugh is a professor of Catholic Studies and director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. It's a research center in the Department of Catholic Studies at DePaul University. After receiving degrees from universities of Notre Dame and Cambridge, he spent 2 years working for the church in a poor area of Santiago, Chile, under the military dictatorship. Upon returning to the United States, he received his PhD, as Colin mentioned, from Duke University under a very prominent and very powerful director, Stanley Hauerwas. We hired Bill Cavanaugh at the University of St. Thomas, where he worked for 15 years. And one of the great mistakes of the University of St. Thomas is they didn't keep him. And while it was St. Thomas's loss, it certainly was DePaul's gain. He is married to a beautiful wife, Tracy, and they have 3 sons with great Irish names: Eamon, Finian, and Declan, right? Not only was Bill a wonderful colleague and good friend, he had a great influence at St. Thomas in so many different ways, and certainly had a great influence on the program that I'm part of called Catholic Studies. Bill invited me to lunch, and it was interesting. I remember the day. It was March 24th, around the year 2000. The reason why I remember it, it was actually the anniversary of the death of St. Oscar Romero. And he had a powerful question for me. He said, how are we going to live our life together as faculty? Right? How are we going to live our life together? And I looked down and said, how? And he says, let's start a Catholic worker house. And I said, Bill, we got no money. We got no time. I don't know how we're going to do it. He goes, I think we'll do it. And of course, we did find somebody with money. His name was Terry Nichols, and he was one of our faculty members. And he bought a house on the west side of St. Paul, and it was called Casa Guadalupana. And it really came from Bill. And from that program actually came another program at St. Thomas that we now call Guadalupe Scholars. And it's one of our larger programs right now. And Bill Cavanaugh was the first director of that. And Bill is just an extraordinary man because he certainly has a great intellect, but he's also a man of deep faith and a capacious heart. And his whole program and his whole work is the integration of those particular things. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Bill Cavanaugh.
Gosh, after those introductions, I kind of feel like I'm at my own funeral or something. This was really, it's really lovely to be here. I loved the Twin Cities, never would have left, but for other kinds of circumstances. And it's just made so many good friends here, and it's really nice to see some of them here. I have friends not only from St. Thomas, but there's Anne from St. Kate's. We were housemates in Chile, in Santiago. There's Kathy, a good friend from the parish. There's John and Suzanne from the dinner group that we had. There's Kia from our neighborhood, good friend of my kids as they were growing up. So it's really, this is a kind of, this is hard. It's much easier to talk to strangers, but you know, there's that old thing about how a prophet is never recognized in his hometown or something. Anyway, thank you for coming out. One story about the quality of a St. Thomas education that always stands out to me. I brought Finian, our little guy, when he was about 3, to the Children's Museum, and there was a giant pickle there. There was a person dressed up in a giant pickle outfit, and I can't remember what that was for, but I brought Finian up and I said, Finian, say hello to Mr. Pickle. And Mr. Pickle says, hi, Professor Cavanaugh. It was one of the seminarians who took my class, and he ended up being a priest in the diocese. So anyway, so I'm going to start with 2 facts, and they're illustrated. I'm going to show you a slide. According to the first fact is, according to recent survey data, more people in the UK believe in ghosts than believe in God. And the second fact is that there is a garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean that is mostly made up of plastics and is currently twice the size of Texas. And I'm going to ask, how are those 2 facts related? Belief in God is waning, but belief in stuff, much of which will end up in landfills or in the ocean, seems to have a lot of momentum. And I'm going to ask if there's some connection between our kind of waning belief in God and our enduring fascination with stuff. But I promise that this is not going to be one of those scoldy kind of lectures where I scold us all for having bad values and being materialistic, because it's not about values. It's about the way the whole system is structured, and it's not about materialism. It's the opposite of materialism. I'm going to try to make that point clear. It's not about materialism. It's about the kind of spiritualization, the transcendence of the material. And so I want to start by asking, what kind of world are we living in? And for that, I want to go to Max Weber, famous German sociologist. He coined a word for the modern world, Entzauberung, which is usually translated disenchantment. And that's, if you know anything about Max Weber, that's what you know about Weber. It's literally the unmagicking of the world. Zauber is the German word for magic. And it's kind of taken for granted. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age says everyone can agree one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in an enchanted world and we do not, right? So people used to believe in gods and demons and fairies and angels and witches and so on. And now we don't. The boundaries between the material and the spiritual used to be permeable. The world was full of what Taylor calls charged objects like saints' relics and so on. But today the story goes, we live in this disenchanted world devoid of spirits and mystery and so on. Objects are just objects and things have just been reduced to materiality. In Weber's view, disenchantment was the end of a long process of rationalization of which science and capitalism were the principal drivers. He called himself unmusical with regard to religion, but he thought that something was lost. He said that we have become specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity, that's us, modern people, imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. He was a dour kind of guy, Max was. And so he famously wrote, we ended up in the iron cage of rationality. Everything has been reduced to this kind of heartless machine. Now, for an example of such a machine, let's visit an Amazon warehouse, right? This is Max Weber's worst nightmare. Low-wage associates, often temporary workers with no benefits, scurry around packing things. A handheld device keeps track of their movements. It'll tell them you got 19 seconds to pick the next item 4 aisles away, that sort of thing. The device keeps track of their pick rate. If they take too long going to the bathroom, they get docked and so on. Turnover rates and injury rates are double the industry average. A third of Amazon workers are on government food vouchers, which can be used online on Amazon, which is another way Amazon profits. In January of 2018, Amazon received patents on a wristband that can track movements. And according to James Bloodworth, who worked in an Amazon warehouse, the real goal is not liberation of human beings, but liberation from human beings. And so he says it was all obsessed with productivity. They started treating human beings as robots, essentially, and if it proves cheaper to replace them with machines, he assumes that they'll do that, and that's what they are doing, according to the New York Times. Human resources are highly automated. Humans are absent from most decisions to hire, manage, discipline, and fire workers. And so Weber's iron cage seems fully vindicated here. But that's only half of the story. The other half of the story is about where we come in as consumers. And that is not the iron cage, that's magic, right? You go to your computer and there are images of millions of things. Anything in the world is available. And then you just make a few clicks and abracadabra, it appears on your doorstep. Right? And the products, you know, the Amazon commercials where the boxes sing and dance, they got the little smiles on them and so on. So they kind of take on life. And so the entire process of sourcing raw materials and manufacturing and transportation and packing and so on, all of that is invisible to the consumer. All the blood and the sweat and the tears that go into the production are all just invisible. You just click and it appears on your doorstep, often fantastically cheap as well. And so the kinds of local community disappears into kind of virtual world. And so these are the two sides of the economy that I want to talk about tonight. The heartless rationality on the one hand and the magic on the other hand. And I'm going to argue that they're two sides of the same coin. And so I'm going to talk about production first and then consumption. And then I'm going to throw a curveball at you and bring the Bible into it and start talking about idolatry. Okay, so we're going to talk Weber, we're going to talk Marx, then we're going to go to the Bible. So, Weber. The story he tells about disenchantment is famously complicated, but I'm going to distill it down to 3 steps. The first step, religion is the original agent of rationalization, but then rationalization pushes religion out of public into the private sphere. And that's what most people know about Weber. But then there's this third step that a lot of people don't notice about Weber, where rationalization produces a new kind of enchantment. He calls it a polytheism of impersonal gods, which include the state and the market. So let's start with step 1. So according to Weber, salvation religions, by which he means Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so on, they are agents of rationalization because they produce a world where the gods are universal and not local. And so you get universal laws that govern nature and society and so on. And since so often in this world, the righteous suffer and the lousy people get rich and have a good time, right? That was the theme of the reading this morning, the Old Testament reading from Malachi, right? Why are the crappy people getting away with this, right? God, why don't you do something? And so, according to Weber, salvation religions come up with an answer for this by presenting an other world, right? So the present suffering in life is explained by the sins that your ancestors committed or you did in a former life, or an afterlife is posited so that the guilty are punished and the righteous are rewarded. So this is how salvation religions are agents of rationalization. But the problem is then this leads to step 2. Now you've got this other world, and now religion becomes otherworldly and eventually gets shoved into out of the public sphere. And what you end up with is the worldly spheres of politics and economics and family and so on. And so salvation religions rationalize suffering. This leads to a split between this world and the other world. And eventually that split widens until you get left with this disenchanted, rationalized world governed by the science and the market and the state and so on. Now, for a lot of people, what they know of Weber ends there, with the elimination of magic from the world, disenchantment. But Weber takes a third step, and he calls it polytheism. And this, he says rationalization actually leads to polytheism. We urgently want to know what our lives are about. What's the meaning of this? And he says science can't answer that for us. The only question that's really important for us is what should we do and how should we live? And so he translates that question into, which of the warring gods should we serve? Or should we serve perhaps an entirely different God? And who is he? So polytheism is this result of rationalization. You can't, there's this divorce between fact and value, and you can't say what you should value. So you just got to choose a value. You got to choose a God, basically. And there's all of these gods that are given to us. The old gods are replaced by the new ones, things like the market and the state and so on. And so he says, we live as did the ancients when their world was not yet disenchanted of its gods, but instead of Aphrodite and Apollo and so on. We still sacrifice today, only the bearing of man has been disenchanted and denuded of its mystical but inwardly genuine plasticity, whatever that means. But the thing to notice is that he thinks that we behave the same way that the ancients did when they were sacrificing to their gods. And so he says, many old gods ascend from their graves. That was the title I wanted for the book, but Oxford University Press said no. Instead, they gave it a boring title instead. Many old gods ascend from their graves. They are disenchanted and hence take the form of impersonal forces. They strive to gain power over our lives, and again they resume their eternal struggle with one another. So in other words, Apollo has been replaced by capitalism, and gods is not just a casual metaphor. Weber thinks we always invent our gods, but then they kind of come to take power over us. So he writes of this tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order bound to technical and economic conditions of machine production, and determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism with irresistible force, right? And so we are dominated by the gods. Material goods have gained an increasing and finally an inexorable power over the lives of men as in no previous period in history. And this is 100 years ago. He's writing this in 1920. Now, Weber was a pessimist, unlike Marx and Nietzsche, who were optimistic. They thought, as soon as we get rid of the gods, everything's going to be all right. Then humans will rule and everything's going to be cool. Weber didn't think we could get rid of the gods. He says, basically, technology produces wonders, but we are subject then to what he calls lebende Maschine, living machines. There is no true God out there to save us from ourselves. And so since there's no inherent order to the cosmos, we end up just being controlled by our own artifacts. And so as Dr. Frankenstein, or as the monster says to Dr. Frankenstein, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." Right? That's Weber in a nutshell, basically. So the gods have returned in another form to rule over us. In the political sphere, he talks about this with regard to the state. War, he says, out religions, religion, basically. War makes for an unconditionally devoted and sacrificial community that is better than anything a religion can do these days. Heroic communities, an ethic of brotherliness, etc. That's in the political sphere. In the economic sphere, he says, capitalism is the height of rationalization, and money becomes the most abstract and impersonal element that exists in human life. And he says, for this reason, one speaks of the rule of capital and not that of capitalists. Right? We are governed by capital and not by capitalists. It's out of our control. And so making money is no longer a means to an end. It is thought of so purely as an end in itself, says Weber. It appears entirely transcendental and absolutely irrational. Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. And so in a supposedly secularized world, we continue to serve gods that are every bit as transcendent and irrational as the gods of old, in Weber's terms. So the holy has not disappeared, but it has migrated from the church to the state and the market. And Weber, of course, is not so much interested in what people say they believe, but in how they actually behave, right? And that's why he can simultaneously say we're disenchanted, but we still serve these other gods. Okay, so far, so good. I hope anyway. Everybody seems to be still awake, or at least alive. That was the first. So I was talking about production there. Now I'm going to talk about consumption. Move from the Amazon warehouse to the packages that arrive at our doorstep. Is that the realm of disenchantment? Well, Karl Marx certainly did not think so. Marx says, look, when a table is made to be used, then there's nothing mysterious about it. It has use value. But when it becomes a commodity for exchange, then, he says, it is changed into something transcendent, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Marx uses theological language all the time. I think that's really metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, commodities, because commodities float free from the conditions of their production and their own physical properties as use values. And so, in order to find an analogy, this is another quote from Marx, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world, right? He thinks it's all a bunch of hooey. Independent beings endowed with life, products of the human brain, and this I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor. So commodity fetishism, he's basically, fetishism not in the sense of just being obsessed about things, but fetishism in the specific meaning of, like, fetishes originally were objects that were kind of endowed with magical powers, right? And that's what he says commodities are like. So commodities, when they're abstracted from their use, they become these kind of weird fetishes, he thinks. Let me give you an example of what he's talking about. Right? Farmers dumping milk, millions of gallons of milk, despite the existence of hungry people, to support the price of milk, or government cheese warehouses, right? Again, there's hungry people, but you want to take all that cheese and put it in a warehouse to support the price of dairy, because prices are what matters. So what matters is the exchange value and not the use value. And so commodities then become dematerialized. Their physical properties are swamped by their exchange value. So cheese is not something for people to eat, but it's a commodity to be exchanged with for money. And because of that, then commodities kind of enter into relationships with one another, and the commodities become personified, Marx says. And at the same time that the commodities are taking on life, the human beings behind their production are being drained of life. So hungry people don't count unless they have money. Labor is abstract and interchangeable. Workers are regarded as labor costs that you want to minimize. And the conditions of work are hidden by the commodities. So when you go to your computer, you don't see the people mining cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the 14-year-old girls working in factories in Thailand. All you see are the shiny products, and all of the production is hidden. So we don't see that the minimum wage for garment workers in Sri Lanka is currently $70 per month. $70 a month. So the commodities are visible, but the humans aren't. So the commodities take on life while life is being drained from people. And so Marx uses biblical language. He talks about Moloch, the Canaanite god who devours human children. And this transfer of life from humans to products is captured by Eduardo Galeano's description of life under free market military dictatorships in Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s. Galeano said people were in prison so that prices could be free. And there's Milton Friedman meeting with General Pinochet. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, people made most of the things that they had, or knew the people that made them. And so things were closely linked to their use value. But now we make almost nothing and we buy everything. And I'm not trying to romanticize the past. Poverty is nothing to be romanticized, right? But it does mark a really significant way, a change in the way that we deal with the material world. A huge change comes around in about the 19th century. Mass production means that there's all this stuff. The quantity of stuff in the world increases by 600% between 1850 and 1890. So with all this stuff, people need to be taught that they have wants that they did not recognize before, right? This is where the science of advertising comes about. So you look at the history of advertising, and it's really interesting to see what happens. So first of all, advertising in the 19th century, here is John Johnson, and he sells shoes. Right? It's informational. You want shoes and boots, you go to John H. Johnson's shop, right? By the early 20th century, though, advertising had come to be then informing, but it's still tied to the actual shoes. So now you've got a lot of text here, and it's talking about the new production process. They invented the Regal Shoe Company in Boston, invented a new last that makes it possible so that the part over to the arch of your foot doesn't wrinkle, etc. And it goes on and on. So it's meant to kind of tell you that the shoes convince you that the shoes are stylish, well-made, reasonably priced, etc. So some of this is intangible, your sense of fashion, but some of it is just about the product itself. By the mid-20th century, you've got an even farther move away from the use value and more towards intangible things, spiritual aspirations, like aspirations for freedom and sex and prestige and recognition. Check this shoe advertisement out from 1972. This now, there is no use value appealed to at all. There's hardly any words here, right? All that text is down to 5 words. And Pavlov and Freud are behind this, right? You appeal to the unconscious, right? And the kind of pathetic male fantasies where if you buy these shoes, women are going to drop at your feet and all this kind of nonsense, right? We all think, of course, this doesn't work on us, which is why it works, right? Because it doesn't work on me, right? We all think that. And so the actual material objects really matter less than the fantasy world that is associated with them. And as the 20th century goes on, then brands become important. Brands become a way of marking one's identity. A corporate manager says corporate branding is about worldwide beliefs management. And by the beginning of the 21st century, the shoe is gone, right? The shoe has now vanished entirely, right? And all you have is this ridiculous kind of, aspiration to be the author of the world to come and so on. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said it's not about materialism, it's the opposite of materialism. It's the vanishing of material things into this gaseous cloud of transcendence, right? And so Naomi Klein, who's very good on these things, says products are made in the factory, but brands are made in the mind. Liberated from the real world burden of stores and product manufacturing, brands are free to soar. Branding in its truest and most advanced incarnation is about corporate transcendence. And this applies to, you outsource the labor to Sri Lanka and you are the kind of branding gurus. And empirical research actually backs up Klein's claim here. There was a study done in the journal Marketing Science just a few years ago by teams of researchers from the US and Israel. And the studies were published as Brands, the Opiate of the Non-Religious Masses. And what they showed was that subjects with strong traditional religious ties were much less likely to choose name brand products for things that are used as forms of self-expression. So the authors conclude that brand loyalty functions as a substitute for traditional religion. So the point is that commodity fetishism is not just an obsession with things. It's not materialism, but transcendence and delocalization. And so last part of the talk then on idolatry. So maybe we're not so disenchanted after all. Enchantment still haunts us. Production becomes a living machine that traps us. Products take on a life of their own. All of this is in the Bible already, 2,000 years before Marx. Idolatry critique, you got to be careful with it because it's also a way of saying you're a heathen and I'm gonna kill you or coerce you, right? So idolatry critique has a bad history, but in some ways it's unavoidable, right? I mean, Pope Francis, lovely guy, he talked about idolatry a lot, and his first encyclical says, basically, when one stops believing in God, you don't just stop believing, you believe in all sorts of things, right? He calls it an aimless passing from one Lord to another. Those who choose not to put their trust in God hear the din of countless idols crying out, put your trust in me, right? And so he uses the language of idolatry when he talks about the economic system, especially. The worship of the golden calf has found a new and heartless image in the cult of money and the dictatorship of an economy which is faceless and lacking any truly humane goal. Anybody know where that golden calf is? Yeah. You've seen that, right? Yeah. So idolatry, though, doesn't refer to, it doesn't necessarily refer to the explicit worship of other gods, the sacrifice of a goat to Baal, right? In the Bible, the idolatry is primarily a matter of behavior and not belief. So it's primarily not a metaphysical error, but an error of loyalty. And so the main images that the Bible uses for idolatry are adultery and political disloyalty. So adultery is in Hosea, where God tells him, marry a prostitute to symbolize the dalliances of Israel with other gods. And the political disloyalty is in 1 Samuel 8, for example, where the Israelites ask for a king to rule over them. And God says to Samuel, it's not you they have rejected, but me. They are now doing to you what exactly they have done to me, deserting me and serving other gods. So the king isn't explicitly worshipped as a god, but putting trust in the king is a type of idolatry. Note, though, that God does accept the existence of kings for the Israelites, but with a good deal of ambivalence, right? Because idolatry in most instances is on a spectrum, right? It's inordinate loyalty to material things. Well, when does that inordinate line gets crossed, right? How much money in your 401k is too much money in your 401k? It's oftentimes not easy. I mean, we're we're living in a material world, and I am a material girl, right? As Madonna says, right? We're material creatures. Material things are good. We need material things to live. Commerce is good, etc. Right? So it's an inordinate amount of trust and loyalty. And so Isaiah says when the Israelites rely on Egypt and Egypt's military, that's a kind of idolatry. Or Paul criticizes those who said whose gods are their bellies, their mind are set on earthly things, warns against greed, which is the same thing as worshiping a false god, right? And so to speak of idolatry in this context, then, of material things is deeply biblical. And it means that in the Bible, idolatry is not just a religious thing, it's an economic and political thing as well. So Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. It's not just about religion. It's also about politics. The word Baal means owner, and the Baalist kings have absolute ownership of property. Property is an alienable commodity under Canaanite law, whereas it's not in Israelite law. And so every generation has its own Baals that are kind of seeking to devour us. So the idea that we've become dominated by our own creations long predates Max Weber, right? It's right there in the Bible. So 1 Samuel 8 again, they ask for a king, and God says that's going to be a replacement for me. So Samuel says, all right, you want a king? I'll give you a king. Here's what the king is going to do. The king will take your sons for his army, your armies, and daughters as servants, confiscate their land and harvest and animals and so on. And finally, you shall be his slaves. This is a quote now. And in that day, you will cry out because of your king, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And so Jesus is drawing on this long tradition of idolatry as domination when he warns that you cannot serve two masters, God and mammon, right? The Greek scripture leaves the word mammon untranslated here to kind of personify money as a god, one that demands service. So the idea in Marx 2 that these inanimate objects come alive by taking life from us, that's already there in the scriptures as well. In Isaiah 6, those who craft idols out of wood and stone become as deaf and dumb and mute as their creations, even while imagining that their creations take on life. In Isaiah 44, there's that thing where a man uses half a block of wood to cook his dinner and the other half to make a god to bow down to. And he imagines that the idol lives, but it's draining life from him. And so the narrator comments, all who make idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Psalm 115, basically repeated in Psalm 135. Their idols are silver and gold. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, and those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. So again, the attribution of life to inanimate objects steals life from the humans who make them. So I said I wasn't going to be a scold, right? But it's kind of the whole way the system is set up. And one of the things I try to emphasize in this book is try to give a sympathetic account to idolatry, because we're all worshiping creatures in some ways, right? I mean, in Exodus 24, the Israelites could stand about 6 weeks of Moses' absence before they really needed something else to worship, right? And the Book of Wisdom sees idolaters as searching for God, but we get bogged down in things. And the reason we get bogged down in things is because God has made the world beautiful, right? These people are little to be blamed, for perhaps they go astray while seeking God and desiring to find him. For while they live among his works, they keep searching and they trust in what they see, because the things that are seen are beautiful. Right? We have a good God who has made a good world, and that's why it's so hard to worship an invisible God, right? Because we're material creatures and the material world is beautiful. And so Paul in Athens, in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, he's distressed to see that the city is full of idols, but he also sees the Athenians' idolatry as evidence that they're groping for God, they're searching for meaning. And so he says, God created everything and is in all things so that people, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him. though indeed he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets, the pagan poets, have said. For we too are his offspring. So there's a sacramental view of the world in this critique of idolatry, right? God can be found in the beautiful things in God's creation. So the last chapter of the book is on sacraments as a kind of antidote to idolatry. The problem is you're not supposed to kind of shun the material world in favor of God, but rather find God in all of the beautiful things, the things that are good in this world. And so I try to kind of work that out through a theology of the sacraments there. So to become real materialists again, right? To see the beauty and the truth in creation. That's what we're being called to. Weber explains this need to worship in terms of the need for meaning, although he thinks inevitably it's just gonna be bad for us. There's no escape from it. Marx is convinced that, you know, when the revolution comes, we'll get rid of the gods and everything will be good. But the revolution came, of course, and a new god was created of the communist state. Right, somewhere between 70 and 110 million people were killed under communist regimes and still counting. So this is, you know, nowadays we kind of tend to think of communism as being something to sort of laugh at. But even though Marx had a lot of interesting things to say, it didn't go well ultimately. Communism was the god that failed. Who was it? Thomas Frank says capitalism is the god that sucked. And so can we find a god that neither fails nor sucks, right? That's kind of the question, right? So unlike both Weber and Marx, the Bible thinks that there is a God out there who can save us from ourselves, and there is a real God behind all of this stuff. And rather than us creating gods, God created us and loves us and wants us to build a kingdom of peace and justice here on earth. And that love then has the final word. What's pulsing throughout all of this creation is ultimately love, and that's the message. So just to finish up, then, have you heard of David Foster Wallace, the novelist, right? He gave that famous commencement address at Kenyon College in the year 2005, and he told the graduates this. He says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And he goes on to say that the reason you might want to worship a real God is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. And so he goes on to say, if you worship money, you'll never have enough. Worship your body and you'll always feel ugly. Worship your intellect and you'll always feel stupid, and so on. Worship power and you'll always be afraid. So that's actually what I start the book with, is this quote from David Foster Wallace. So I just want to conclude with this notion that everybody worships and draw 4 conclusions from this. First, I think this should elicit sympathy in us across all of these different lines. If it's true that everybody worships, it levels the playing field, right? Everybody is looking for something, right? That's the eurythmics. Right. Everybody's got a hungry heart, if you prefer Bruce Springsteen. Right. Everybody is looking for something. There isn't then this kind of yawning gap between believers and unbelievers or non-believers. Right. Everybody believes in something. It's not that, well, there's believers and they believe crazy stuff, and then there's the people who just have facts. right? I think we have a lot more in common than that. So don't tell me you're a non-believer. Tell me what you believe. I'll tell you what I believe. And then let's have a conversation, right? I mean, I think this kind of helpfully confuses those lines between believers and unbelievers. Secondly, though, idolatry critique has to be self-critique, first of all. If we all worship, it's also true that we all worship badly, right? And that includes me and everybody else in this room, right? Just because Christians claim to worship Jesus doesn't mean that they actually do, right? It's about, again, like Weber emphasizes in the Bible too, it's about behavior. It's not about belief so much. It's not what you claim to believe, but it's about what your actions reveal about what you really believe. And sometimes Christians are the worst idolaters, right? I mean, the reason I think that a lot of people are walking away from the church these days is because politics, the church has gotten messed up. They've hitched the gospel to party politics, and this is toxic. Third, then, the critique of idolatry is a challenge for us. Avoiding idolatry isn't just as simple as changing your attitude. It's about these larger structures that we're all kind of held by. So in an unjust system, we're all idolaters, and there needs to be systemic change to free us all from false worship. And so we need to be attentive to the kind of everyday practices that we engage in. And that means mundane things like where we work and what we buy and what we wear and where we direct our eyes and all of that kind of stuff that make us, that bring us into this kind of idolatry. So boycotting certain types of businesses, I think, for example, but also creating businesses that Mike Naughton talks about, all the kinds of businesses that promote the common good and promote local economies and worker ownership and things like that. Speaking out against injustices in our economic and political systems and creating what Pope Benedict called an economy of gift. And that is an economy in which you can see people. Right? You don't just see products, but you see people. And that means building local economies. And fourth and finally, then, I want to emphasize that is a summons to joy and not just beating ourselves up, right? We're not called to complete renunciation of the world, but a more joyful and sacramental way of living in the world, right? Seeing the world as beautiful, and living into that and making it beautiful through our actions. So sacrament is encountering the invisible God in the visible material world. And so a joyful economy is one where the material goods facilitate the encounter with other people and with God. So there's joy at the farmer's market, for example, when the carrots that you buy are kind of embedded in these human relationships. You might pay a little bit more than you would at Walmart or on Amazon, right? But there's a kind of joyful moment there. And that's just one small example of different ways that we can consume in ways that contribute to the flourishing of producers, consumers, the earth. And in this way, trying to kind of heal some of the idolatry of giving life to products while taking life away from people. So I'm going to leave on that note of joy, and we've got some time for a conversation, I think. So let's go ahead.
Dr. Cavanaugh. We do have some time for some questions. If you would, please be aware that there are other people that may have questions as you ask them. And please limit yourself to a short question, and please questions and not comments, since we want to hear from Dr. Cavanaugh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Maybe your talk is the answer, but another sort of analysis is one of distraction from distraction by distraction.
Yeah.
Right? And I wonder how you think about your story of seeing our world as a world of sort of consumers and commodity transcendence, and how do you connect that and relate that to sort of analyses that see our world as a world that somehow keeps us distracted, keeps us shallow, keeps us from thinking about the transcendent?
Yeah.
And I just wonder how you think about those two dynamics.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There's so much to kind of remove us. Detachment is a kind of thing that I've talked about before, and detachment is that kind of detachment from. It's detachment from production. We don't make anything. It's detachment from producers. We don't encounter the people. It's detachment from products themselves, because they have to be obsolete. We have to keep the consumption moving by not getting too attached to even the products themselves, right? And so one of the ways to do that then is just kind of following the shiny object, which we're constantly being led to do with increasing sophistication, right? By these, what do you call them? The what's that? Algorithm. Thank you, John. Yeah, the algorithms, right? The algorithm is another name for God these days, right? The all-knowing being that sees inside of us and wants us to act a certain way. And in this case, it's to buy things. But just a simple kind of thing, the way that our phones keep us from one another. I was really struck. You remember a couple of years ago, it was the Oscars, and I think it was Jimmy Kimmel was hosting, and he brought a group of tourists who didn't know that they were going to be, and brought them into the actual Oscars ceremony. Do you remember that? And what did they do? So you bring these people in, these kind of ordinary people, and they didn't know that they were going to be crashing the Oscars ceremony. So you bring them in, and there, sitting in the front row, is Brad Pitt and Meryl Streep and all of these other celebrities. What do? Instead of like reaching out to shake their hands and connect with them, all of them were doing this, right? They were all kind of recording it, just kind of, there's Meryl Streep right there, and I'm going, because you gotta. So it's just this way of distancing ourselves from life, right? From the material world. I mean, that's one of the ways in which we live in such a dematerialized, delocalized, unbodily kind of world. Yeah. So absolutely. Thank you.
Where do you find grounds for hope and optimism?
Oh, yeah. There's one of the things that I try to do in the little book that I have called Being Consumed is try to give concrete examples of other forms of economy that are promoting this sort of thing. And once you start looking, they're all over the place, right? There was a thing, I don't know if it's still going, but when we lived in the Twin Cities, there was the Whole Farm Co-op that that marketed through the churches. So it was a co-op of organic farmers that so you would buy direct from them and go pick it up from the church. We used to get our eggs
from this guy who used to put little typewritten notes in the cartons of eggs, telling you how his chickens were doing, and you know, that his neighbor's mad at him for not spraying his weeds and stuff like that. I mean, there's all sorts. There's just a million of different kinds. I mean, this is one of the things that Mike Naughton does in his work is focus attention on companies that are there's even like there's, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Mondragon company in Spain. It's a multi-billion-dollar corporation, like $3 billion of annual sales, and they make all kinds of industrial equipment and other things. It was started by a priest, by a Basque priest, influenced by these ideas of distributism and so on, and trying to break down this divide between the owners of capital and the workers. He said, you got to make the workers the owners, right? So it's an owner-operated, owner-managed, worker-operated, worker-managed, worker-owned corporation, and quite large, and you know, various growing pains with regard to getting that large. But it's still, it was started in the 1950s, and it's still kind of operated on these principles. So there's all kinds. I mean, part of why I wanted to end on joy is because the worst thing is the kind of defeatism, and I feel it all the time, right? I mean, we've been told that the economy is just this thing out there, and it's like the weather. We just don't have any, there's just this big thing called the economy, and we just, you know, read the news and find out what the economy is doing, and there's nothing that we can do about it, right? But instead, try to think about economies. There's all kinds of different economies, and the more local that you can make these economies, the better. Years ago, my brother and I were bicycling from Chicago to Minneapolis, and we stayed with my godparents, my aunt and uncle in Winona, and discovered this in the room that I slept in. It was a geography textbook from 1952 from my cousin's Catholic grade school, and it was called World Neighbors. And it had this section on sharing goods through trade. And it was all about all this kind of stuff about how in the Middle Ages there was the just price, but today we think that prices ought to be set by supply and demand, and there's all this kind of stuff. And they showed this small town, Westphalia, Iowa, that was run by this priest with it, and it had all these cooperative businesses and everything. And it was this vision of what a Catholic economy would look like. And it was fascinating, right? But the idea that there could be an economy, a Catholic economy, is something that we've lost. So now my kids went to Catholic grade school, and they use the same geography texts as the kids from the public schools, right? Nothing wrong with public schools, right? But the idea that you could do something different, right? The idea that there's not just the economy here, but there's Jewish economies, and there's socialist economies, and there's Catholic economies, and all of these different possibilities is just something that we've sort of lost. And so we've become so passive in so many different ways. And so what I'm trying to kind of emphasize is the possibility that there's other things that you can do, and that people are doing kind of all the time. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer to your question. We were asking you to keep the question short, and here I am. Yeah. Anyway.
I have not finished reading the book, Uses of Idolatry, but I 2/3 of the way through, and something that really struck me, which you mentioned here, so I'm taking it as permission to ask. I'm really more stuck on the nationalism chapter, but you mentioned in the Israelites that you're talking about how worship involved loyalty to God and involved political and economic decisions. And you mentioned that property rights were inalienable. And that really struck me because you get an extremely Catholic way of writing, which is not afraid to say things that you're later going to smack down. Say them like very confidently, like you're not qualifying it as like, well, so and so says this, but I'm raising my eyebrows, so you know I disagree. So it's not entirely clear to me whether or not you're agreeing that under properly worshiping Yahweh, property rights are inalienable. But within the rest of your analysis, our concept of property rights, like John Locke, fee simple absolute, this idea that you can exhaust, you can alienate, you can commit waste, all the things of our understanding of how property works. And I'm wondering, is there a critique of our U.S. sense of property rights and rights as opposed to responsibilities and relationships with property? Like, is that factor? Because to me, it seems implicit in everything that you're saying, but I don't know if that's something that becomes explicit or if that's something that you care about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me separate out a couple of different issues. One is the issue of alienability of property. And the point, although whether this was actually practiced is a point of contention, right? How much the biblical idea, the Old Testament ideal was actually put into practice is a question. But at least in theory, property is inalienable in the sense that each family has their own, what is the Hebrew word? It's like Nahala or something like that. And so that's why, like in the Jubilee year, the property is to be returned to the original family so that it doesn't become a commodity, right? So that everybody's got some, right? And so there's that sense of inalienability. But then what develops in modernity is absolute property rights, which means it's my property and I can do whatever I want with it. And that is kind of Bible for the kind of liberal tradition, right? But it's not for Catholic social tradition. So John Paul II talked about a social mortgage on property, and that's goes all the way back to the church fathers in the early centuries. Thomas Aquinas says, yeah, there's private property, but it should always be treated. So he distinguishes between property ownership and property use, and he says in ownership, private property is a good. People take care of their own stuff better than they would if it was communal property. The example I use for that when I'm teaching it to undergraduates is the refrigerator in your house that you share with your other housemates, right? If it's nobody's job to clean the refrigerator, then the refrigerator gets really nasty very quickly. But he says, but with regard to use, property should be regarded as common so that you communicate it to others in their need, right? And that is picked up. That's this idea of a social mortgage. You don't own your property outright. You owe it to you have to use it for the benefit, especially of those who are the most poor and the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And that, I think, is a bedrock proposition of Catholic social teaching, is that there is no absolute right to property. It's always a social, mediated through social purpose, through the common good, especially for those who are most in need. Yeah. Is that good?
Follow-up question to that.
Say what?
Follow-up question to that.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, no, it's all over. What's that?
They seem to be very concerned with their private property.
Yeah, right.
That's like the people who care the most about real estate are the ones who go up in the hierarchy.
Yeah, right, exactly. And they would say, oh, it's all for the common good. Whether it is or not is another question, right? But in theory, right, then, right, this is what we used to say yeah, that's right. We used to say that in graduate school all the time. It's like, oh, sure, it works in practice, but how does it work in theory? Right?
Could you, there's kind of a mention of freedom, you know, the understanding of freedom is sometimes confused. You know, freedom from, you know, license versus, you know, freedom for, and how it relates to our discipleship. Yeah, if you can, is there a connection between what we're talking about and our notion or our understanding of freedom from a, particularly from a Catholic Christian tradition?
Sure. Yeah. Good question, Paul. So the distinction between negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from interference, and positive freedom is like the positive ability to do something good, right? So if you're somebody plagued with alcoholism, you've got an open liquor store and you got $20, you're free in the negative sense to go get what you want. But in a positive sense, you're kind of enslaved in that way, right? So a full sense of freedom recognizes both the negative and the positive senses of this. And so often in modernity, freedom gets whittled down to just the negative, right? So freedom means freedom from interference, freedom from you, right? And that's the kind of argument to be made for absolute property rights, right? That the bedrock of freedom is freedom from interference. That's Milton Friedman, right? If I have not defrauded you and you voluntarily enter into this, then it's free, right? I think what Catholic social teaching tries to do is ask the much larger questions, right? I mean, if somebody is so desperate that they take a job making 50 cents an hour working in a factory in Honduras, is that really freedom? Well, according to Friedman's definition, it is. You know, I get your labor, you get paid, it's a free transaction, you know, it's better than starvation for you, and so it's free, right? In a larger sense, of course, you have to look at all of the ways the deck is stacked and the way that power works, and that's the kind of importance of bringing in the positive definition of freedom. Yeah.
I'll give Daniel the last question here, and then we can adjourn to informal conversation.
The examples you gave of how to buy locally and examples of companies that maybe are properly owned and stuff. I was like, I personally try to do things like that. And the question that I always come to is question that's more on my mind is how do you stop behaving as the type of economic subject or liberal individual subject that this type of economy thrives on? Or do you have examples of communities or different ways of trying to live a lifestyle that means that you're less, your desires and your inclinations are less drawn to the kind of things that our economy offers because you're being drawn into something else that's more beautiful. If that makes sense, if there's this issue of desire going on, it's going to be really hard to fight idolatry if you're not being drawn into something else. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. So the question
is examples of. Do you have any examples of lifestyles or community practices that can draw you away from being kind of an individual consumer towards being someone who's being towards God, drawn towards God, or deeper into love of neighbor or love of creation?
Yeah. I think there's lots of people out there that are doing it, and it starts with simple things like I mean, so I teach a class on consumerism and Christianity. And one of the things that we do is a thing that I picked up from a guy who teaches at taught at East Carolina University. He called it the Monastic Project, but it's basically a 3-week experiment where where students have an experience of asceticism. So it's voluntary; they can do it or not. Usually, about half the class does it, and it's 3 weeks with no phones, computer use other than for school. Meat, sex, alcohol, tobacco, some kind of meditation or prayer for an hour a day, certain practices of silence, and so on. And a lot of times students find this, the ones who survive find it transformative, right? It's just, one young woman said, I hadn't heard birds chirping since I was a little girl, because she goes around with her earbuds in her ears all the time. So there's this sense in which asceticism is, in that sense, is not this kind of renunciation of good things, but it's the kind of getting back in touch with the world and people, and that I think is really important. I've got a colleague at DePaul who teaches a course on love, and they do a section on St. Vincent de Paul, who is the patron saint of the university. And the students love Vincent de Paul, and we talk about him all the time because he was all about justice for the poor, and he would spend all of his time with the poor and everything. And so they're all over that. But then they find out that he spent 4 hours a day in prayer. And it's like, God, what a waste of time. Are you kidding me? So this colleague of mine, he'll say, to somebody making that objection, he'll say, you've got an iPhone, right? Yeah. The iPhones have that thing on that you can tell like how many hours you've been on in the past week. And so they'll pull it out and they'll look, and it's like, oh, yeah, I've been on like an average of 7 hours a day, right? Some people have already been, like the class is 11 o'clock in the morning, they've already been on their phone for 5 hours, right, that day, right? And then it's like, and then the light bulbs go on, it's like, oh, that's how you can spend 4 hours a day in prayer, right? So there's, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's all these kinds of different practices that we just sort of take for granted that we don't have to, right? We can be, once you start thinking of them as something that's got a grip on you, then I think they're easier to let go.